All right.
Yeah.
Then, thank you, Sanne. And
thanks, Lorenzo. And also thanks to Lars for inviting me to this very nice series. So what I'm going to talk about today, the title is The Mechanistic Role of Oscillations in Temporal and Contact Predictions, Interactions between When and What. What I mean with that will become clear later. I know this is language, but I'm going to but I also know this institute does more than just language. I don't know how many people are here. So the first part will be more about other stuff related to oscillations, also working memory, and then the last section will be fully dedicated to I would say speech. I cannot call it language anymore. I call it speech. But I do think the first part is very relevant. So if you're really interested in language and speech, bear with me that the beginning maybe sounds irrelevant, but I'll tell you at the end, I hope you understand why it was relevant. Okay, so, well, this is the assumption make that you have a bit of experience about what oscillations are. So what the oscillations are to me, it's a population level activity, which are neural fluctuations of electric potentials. And if you measure it, if you measure with electric recordings, where you can also measure multi-unit activity, you will see that this activity tends to cluster at specific phases of the ongoing oscillations. This is an example of LFP recordings in monkeys. And in the bottom, you can see the multi-unit activity. And you can see that the spikes of the multi-unit activity are specifically, in this case here, at the dip. So when the cells are already partly depolarized. So this means that there's specific moments where there seems to be more activity than other moments. So this to me is one core feature of oscillations that we have to consider when investigating oscillations for other cognitive operations. I said this, firing rates cluster along specific oscillatory phases. And if you would analyze this in a better way, this is done by Saskia Hagens, you can see here that the firing rates and this is for alpha, so not only for high frequencies, you can see that the firing rates really seems to cluster, it's stronger at specific phases versus other phases. So the goal of my research line is kind of to find a link between oscillations and cognitions, really having as a starting point is really low-level fundamental features of oscillations. So I will talk a bit about perception, working memory, and at the end, most of the talk will be dedicated to speech. So how could oscillations actually influence cognitive operations? So I tend to focus on two, to me, computational properties that oscillations could have, which could be important for perception and speech and memory. On the one hand, as I said, there are specific points where there generally seems to be more multi-unit activity. So it could be that oscillation provides windows for optimal processing. I also call this a bit the when. So there's specific moments on the oscillations when processing is optimized because there's simply more activity at that moment. So input that arrives might be processed more optimally. Secondly, this is more from the field of memory and less from the field of perception, is that oscillations also have been provided an idea that they provide representational separation. And what do I mean with this? Well, what I mean with this is that different representations might be activated at different moments of this oscillation. I'll come to this later in the talk. So oscillations could actually provide a means, if you have different representations, that you have to memorize different items, that you kind of order them on the different phases and therefore can separate the representations better. I get to that later. So these are two computational functions that oscillations could have. So let's start with the first, if there's evidence for this. So do oscillations provide windows of excitability? What would this then mean? Well, as I said, there's multi-unit activity or firing rates that seems to be clustered at specific moments. So there are moments of the oscillations that are more excitable than other. And how does this then link to cognition? Well, how it could link to cognition if you simply present something at a specific moment or a specific phase that is more excitable, maybe it's simply processed more efficiently. I will give an example of one study that actually shows this. So if you present something at a specific phase, it's processed more efficiently. This is a study by Laura Juji and colleagues. What they did here is that they did EEG study together with TMS. And when you present a TMS pulse on the visual areas, you can perceive something that's called a phosphene. And this is like a visual experience when you present a TMS pulse over the occipital areas. And what they did is they compared the phase at which participants detected the phosphene versus when participants didn't detect this phosphene, and then looked back at the EEG whether the phase at which this TMS pulse was presented was related to the perception of the participants. So here, this is actually the ERP, and this is a difference between whether participant perceived the phosphene or not. So here's the TMS pulse. That's why it's blanked out, because it contains a very big artifact. But the interesting thing is before. So you can see the difference actually starts oscillating, which means that at specific phases when you presented this TMS pulse, participants were more likely to perceive this phosphene. So this seems to indeed provide some evidence for this excitability modulation directly relating to perception. And when you do this in the frequency domain, which you can see on the left, you could indeed see that this seemed to happen along the alpha range, which makes some amount of sense because we know in the visual areas there's a very strong alpha oscillator there. So this is one study that shows that pre-stimulus phase determines whether, I wouldn't say what, but whether participants perceive something. So this provides in some sense some evidence that if something arrives at a more excitable phase, although you cannot really measure this very well with EEG, but we can conclude this in some way from it. If something arrives at a more excitable phase, is this processed more efficiently? This also becomes, then you say, well, okay, but how can we use this, right? Because this is just a consequence of what's randomly happening in our brain. Well, you can also use it because if you have rhythmic input, in speech we might have not fully rhythmic, but pseudo-rhythmic input. But if you have rhythmic input, it has been proposed that these oscillations in the brain start aligning to the input structure and thereby align the excitable moments to the moments that input actually arrives. There's a lot of evidence for this. The first question is, okay, why is it relevant? So here, oscillation become more relevant and have a more active role because there are many rhythms in the environment. One is in music, but also in speech, and also in biological motion. There's a lot of rhythmicity in our environment. And we could use oscillations to align to these rhythmic structures to actually have these high excitable phases align with the moments that perceptual input arrives. So one study that I did in New York, in collaboration with Dr. Zango-Lombik and Professor Schroeder, is where we used a study in which we called it subthreshold entrainment. So does everybody familiar with the concept of entrainment here? I see some nods. If anybody doesn't, does it? Okay. So the idea here is indeed what I explained, this alignment of oscillations. But here, what was interesting is that in the beginning, participants didn't hear the sounds. So what we did is that we presented sounds in a rhythmic structure that at the beginning were subthreshold, so participants didn't detect them. But then we start increasing them in intensity, and at some point participants could hear them, they pressed the button, I could hear it, and then the next trial started. And what we found interesting is to see whether before the onset of participants actually hearing the sounds, there was already some kind of following of the rhythmic structure due to entrainment. Let me see, why is it not continuing? I lost my mouse. Okay. So what you can see here is 0 is the moment that participants indicated this is the stimulus I detected. And the interesting thing is when we look back. So this is stimuli that participants didn't detect yet. And this is, for example, the 6th stimulus that before participants say they detect the sound. And we compared a random stream of randomly presented in time, randomly presented sounds versus a rhythmic structure. And you could already see a difference in the intertrial coherence, which is a measure of phase consistency over trials between these two conditions. So prior to participants even hearing the sounds, phases already align to the rhythmic input structure. This might be important for people that are more into this topic, but we found it interesting. We also looked at power. So this is the power of the stimulus rate. Because there's always a big confounder if you present rhythmic stimulus stream, there's also just an increase in power at that rate. But for the subthreshold stimuli, we couldn't find any of this power increases prior to participants detecting it. So when participants detected the sound, then the power increased, but both for the random and rhythmic stream actually equally. But beforehand, we found a strong intertrial. Why is this here? I don't know. Somebody is on Zoom there, I think. Prior to the detection, we didn't find an effect of power, but only an effect of intertrial coherence. So this seems to indeed suggest that this rhythmic tracking or aligning to the rhythmic input stream it could be a relevant behavioral measure to detect whether something to better process these rhythmic structures.
Can I ask a question?
That, of course.
I wonder where those oscillations happen, in which area of the brain?
Let me think. So here what we did is we picked the electrodes that had the strongest N1 response. So that's where the electrodes that you're looking at, this is MEG, but it's related to the sensors, so I shouldn't say electrode, but sensors that are most sensitive, that had the strongest N1 response. We had, unfortunately, only 2 subjects with ECOG also in this study, but it was actually funnily quite widespread. I would have expected it really in the auditory system, but we had some, for one patient, quite wide coverage, but many electrodes had this effect actually.
Thank you.
Yeah. Good. Then, well, I can spend the whole lecture only on this topic of phase being important for rhythmic perception, or pre-stimulus phase being important for detection. But yeah, if you're interested, here's a whole list of papers that show, on the one hand, rhythmic facilitation of sensory processing when you have a rhythmic stream. And on the other hand, that pre-stimulus ongoing phase influences perception, and most studies are detection. And there's also a very good review by Hagens and Zayn-Golombik on this topic. But yeah, I want to go further and also talk about this word perspective and go to speech. So, as I said, oscillations could provide these temporal windows of processing opportunity. So there's specific phases where simply there's better processing, and this could help to process rhythmic structures more efficiently. Still, there are some open questions to me. Many of these studies, especially these pre-stimulus studies, they do detection. And very little studies actually investigate whether this increased excitability has actually an effect on sensitivity or rather only on detection. So it might be that participants rather just simply say there are more stimuli, or they perceive something more frequent, but they're not more sensitive necessarily. So is it really more optimal? This is still unclear. And if we look at the exact phase that is the most optimal, it doesn't seem to be consistent over participants often. So many of my studies, I find effect of phase, and it's systematic within a participant which phase is the best, but it's not necessarily very consistent across participants. So this is also another open question to me that needs in this field of that needs answering, which actually I'm not going to answer at all. I'm going to now switch to this second computational operation. The second computational operation that oscillations could have is that it has been proposed that they provide representational separation. So this is a proposal from Lisman and Jensen in 2015, but others have also proposed some similar things. Is that, for example, if I have to hold information in working memory, it is important that these memory representations don't mix. So it's very important that information not only is actively memorized in a working memory sense, but that also the representations are separated from each other, that they don't start mixing. For example, if I have apples and oranges, they have a lot of overlapping features, but I still very easily can distinctively memorize both of them. And it has been proposed that the oscillatory phase could be a means to do this separation. So we represent multiple items, and here there are these lines that are different representation, but they're simply represented at different moments of the ongoing oscillation. So this is very relevant for what I already said during working memory, but also to make sure that information is bound together on a specific phase. For example, apples have multiple features, which you have to bind these features together. And it might also be important for retrieval that, especially when you have to separate items from each other. When you retrieve them, you need to be sure you have the right item. So I investigated this effect to investigate if phase is really relevant for these working memory representations. So in 2020, we published this study where we investigate whether phase influences working memory representations, and whether this also has an effect on working memory performance. So what we did in this study is that we had this task in which we present, it's a task that we first reanalyzed data and then collected our own data. But it's the task that Wolfendahl introduced in 2015. The task is you present an item, in this case a Gabor patch with a specific orientation. And at the end of the trial, you present a target item that is rotated. And participants simply have to say, is a target item rotated clockwise or counterclockwise relative to the sample. So they have to keep the orientation of the sample in mind. The trick of this study is that halfway through this retention period, an impulse can be presented. And this impulse is like a bullseye item. And the goal of this impulse is to activate representations of the memory that is currently in mind. And this has been shown by Wolfendahl 2015 and many other papers came after. If you with EEG try to decode the orientation of this sample, what happens in the beginning, you can do it because it's simply the perceptual representation. But during the retention period, especially with EEG, this decoding performance really drops, that you are at chance. But when you present this impulse, some weird thing happens that suddenly you can decode the orientation of the sample again. So by presenting this impulse, there's suddenly more information again about the orientation that was in mind. And note that this is important because this impulse has no information about orientation, right? It's just random. So it simply means that there's something that just sends a overall big impulse activation through the system that activates the representation. Why we thought this was interesting? Well, because of this property, we can now look whether this decoding is dependent on the phase. So we like this paradigm for this reason. So what we did is that we had this sample item, and this is the EEG pipeline, in which we trained the classifier to tell us the orientation of the sample. And then we tested, we'll use this as the testing data. So this is the training data of the classifier, and this is the testing data of the classifier. Yes. So what we did is that we trained the classifier to detect the orientation, and then we tested it during this impulse period. So there was a generalization kind of decoding approach. What's important for us here is whether the performance of this classifier depended on the phase. Because if this was dependent on the phase, it means that there were specific phases where there was more information about the working memory item than other phases. So this was our goal. So we tested here what the orientation was, and we extracted the phase prior to the impulse. And then we looked at trials that were collectively classified. And then, okay, now a lot of steps follow. And then we looked at the consistency of the phase of those correctly classified trials. And if there was some consistency of these phases higher than chance, you would say, well, then there is a phase where apparently there's more information for the classifier to extract the information. So this would be phase-dependent decoding, meaning phase-dependent information about the working memory item. Okay. So, and what is our dependent variable here? Well, this is so the phase consistency, which is the vector length. So that's the length of this line, which is mathematically equivalent to intertrial coherence, actually. But that's if you're more familiar with that term. So what we found is, so what this is always a bit difficult to see. What you find here on the y-axis, you see frequency. So that's the frequency of the phase that we estimated prior to the impulse. And what you see here is the decoding time after the impulse. So the oscillation phase is always estimated prior, and the time can be any other moment after the impulse. And what we found is that there were specific moments after this impulse was presented, is that the working memory representation seemed to cluster on specific phases of the oscillation. We didn't find, ideally you would have found it very nicely clustered around one frequency range that we didn't really find. We found these more broadband periods. But still it seems, so I find it always more difficult to call it clearly an oscillation, but at least we found some evidence that there is phase-dependent classification of a working memory representation, which goes quite far beyond this idea of detection only. On the right, I don't know. Yeah, it shows. Let's ignore the right because it shows the same as the left. So then the question was, okay, is this also relevant for behavior? So then we looked at trials where participants accurately indicated, so they did the task correct, and we kind of did the same thing. So we looked at the phase, we looked at this phase again, and then we did a similar thing. We correlated these phases with whether participants were correct or not, whether participants were correct. So we again did this phase clustering for correct trials, but now not correct based on the classifier, but based on correct on the behavioral performance. And we did the same thing, but we only focused on the frequency that was significant in the EEG analysis. And then again, we found a significant effect. So this is only one data point because we only looked at that significant point, where we found that participants indeed had phases where they were more correct and other phases where they were less correct. So that if you present this impulse at a specific phase, that boosts the working memory representation, not only in the EEG decoding, but also in the behavioral performance of participants later. So to conclude, halfway through, the working memory representations cluster on specific oscillatory phases. And, oh yeah, this I didn't explain, but we showed that was not necessarily the most excitable phase. Yes. Oh, then I will switch to speech for the people here. So this idea of representation separation, I find it always interesting, because if this is the case, then if a stimulus is ambiguous and you present it at the moment that is more like item A is represented or item B is represented, the perception actually depends on this phase, right? Because if you present something that is like orange purplish, if you randomly seem to happen to present it at the moment that orange is represented, then you should be biased to orange. So this I actually did in a speech study, and then I will also switch the rest to also more the speech domain and the implications for speech, where we had a stimulus that could either be interpreted as a da or as a ga in Dutch, but I guess it will work in German, and often in English it also works. So for the people that are familiar with this format representations, what we did is that we had an auditory da, and then we moved the whole third format down, and that generated a percept that was a ga. So it sounds, this was the original stimulus. Da. Da. This was the other extreme, the ga. Da. And this is the middle one. Da. I don't know if I present a few times, some people can have a very ambiguous percept also like in a lecture hall, but some don't. Da. Da. There's it, yeah. People switch, anybody switches between the two, but yeah, so that's the idea. So what was the goal of this? So we had this ambiguous stimuli, and then the interesting question was, okay, if there is this representation that on one phase da is represented and the other ga, can we see this phase dependent bias? So we just presented this ambiguous stimuli over and over again. Asked participants, what do you hear? We measured EEG and we looked whether, depending on whether they perceived da or ga, whether they were more likely to, depending on the phase, whether they were more likely to perceive one or the other. So I'm skipping a bit the analysis steps for now and just go to the results. The interpretation is similar as before. So what you can see here, these are the unambiguous stimuli, and here are the ambiguous stimuli. This is the time of presentation. And you can, if you look back at time 0, this is again the vector length, but it represents something else. But what is important to know, this vector length represents whether participants are more biased to one or the other. And again, you see that prior to the stimulus, depending on what people perceive, the phase was something else. So participants were more likely to perceive da or ga dependent on the pre-stimulus phase. I can visualize this differently in a phase plot, who's familiar with phase plot. So the unambiguous is completely random. What you can see in the ambiguous is the difference between participants perceiving da and participants perceiving ga. You can see that this difference is around 180 degrees. So really there's a very big, so if it's one phase or the opposite phase, participants really perceive the opposite thing. And a single dot is a single participant, so it clusters quite nicely. You can test the same kind of hypothesis where the phase depends on where the perception depends on the phase in a different manner, using a sensory entrainment. So this is EEG, but you could try to do the same not using EEG. Maybe you're familiar with these studies. So the idea is that you present a rhythmic stream and thereby entrain the ongoing oscillations. And at the end of the rhythmic stream, you present this ambiguous stimuli again, but at different moments in time. And the idea is that the different moments in time then represent different phases relative to the entrained oscillation. So participants don't like these experiments. It sounds like this. Yeah, so this then a lot. But yeah, so again, you just ask, do you hear da or ga? And then the question is, depending on the time that you present the stimulus relative to the entrainment train, do you see this oscillation in the behavior? So this is the result. So again, this is da ga. This is the rate 6.25, which was chosen because in the EEG we found there the strongest effect. And you again see, this is the stimulus onset of synchrony. You see an oscillatory pattern that matches the stimulation rate. We could fit a sinusoid to fit this data. So really there was a difference depending on when you presented. Participants were more likely to perceive a da or to perceive a ga. Yes, so far regarding oscillations for representational separation and then more in the speech domain, is that oscillations could be there to represent information and to avoid overlapping representation. Then I always had a very open question, being what determines the phase position? So I sort of showed one phase is one and the other phase is the other. But why this phase is one and the other is the other, I always had, this never was answered with this study of mine. And the question is, are there some intrinsic orders in the brain? Are there lists? There are actually hypotheses about it. For example, Jensen proposed in the alpha domain that it might be that oscillations indeed are excitability modulation. So it could be that this order comes automatically from items being more excitable and therefore being already more active on less excitable oscillatory phases. Yes, two excitations. And there are other theories of lists in the working memory domain, specifically in rat hippocampus studies, where they show that the phase at which an item is represented is, for example, they find this in the theta, that if a rat has to move through a maze, that the positions that it will go to in the future are, this is a common phase procession, I see many people not, that the future positions are represented at specific phases. So the first coming position is already on a early, not so excitable phase, and then the next and the next and the next comes after. And then it's, as the rat moves through the maze, it progresses, of course. This kind of idea has also been, this is also more from this phase procession rat hippocampus literature, comes more in a computational kind of idea in which they said, well, let's say you have an oscillation that governs the overall inhibition of neuronal populations. And on top of that, you have excitatory input. But dependent on there might be some neurons that, like if there's a lot of excitation coming in, for example, here, you will only be active when there is very high inhibition. So, yeah, so let's see, here's the excitation. So when there is very little excitation and there is very little inhibition, then already the neural postulation can get activated, right? But if there's a lot of inhibition of the oscillation, you need also a lot of excitation to overcome this inhibition. So the idea here is that if you have a representation that just is generally either very sensitive or gets a lot of input, excitatory input, this one will simply be activated at moments of the oscillations where there is also a lot of inhibition, because it doesn't matter. But some other representations that are not so sensitive, they might need a lot of excitatory input to get activated. And that could be that this is the order that is generated in the brain. So to put this in the speech domain, what we figured more in a computational model in 2021, which I did in Nijmegen, is in the speech domain, it simply would mean that neural populations that represent information which is more expected should simply be activated earlier on the oscillatory cycle. Does this make sense? Because this will come back a lot. Okay, this makes sense. Cool. So we created a model in which generally oscillatory model seems to focus on this oscillatory tracking models focus only on this part. And then we have a lot of speech models that focus on prediction, but there are not so many models that incorporate both of them. So that's a bit what we try to do. We have an oscillatory tracking model, but it also incorporates feedback based on the content of the information. Yes. So we call this model speech timing in a model constrained oscillatory network. And like the toy model I use, I like it because it's about cake. So the toy model we use, so this is a model that just has an oscillator that it trains to the speech rates, but on top of it, it has a language model that tries to predict what stimulus is coming next. So this is more in a predictive coding network fashion. But of course, in language, it's very common that we try to predict what comes next. So this is a model of the world, and this model has only seen 3 sentences, which are the sentences, I eat cake, I eat nice cake, and I eat very nice cake. And what you can see here, the rows represent the input and the columns represent the prediction. So if I is presented, the word will only predict eat, because that's the only thing that can follow. But the interesting thing is when eat is presenting, because when eat is presented, 3 different other words can follow. And by design of this model, we made it that the predictions have different levels. So most of the time it's I eat cake, boring cake. It's not based on actual corpus, but that maybe comes later. But by design, we just made it to predict cake more than it predicts nice and very. So what happens when you add this to the model? So let's say we have central input, which is I eat. So this is at relatively at a specific pace. I eat. What happens to this model is that the feedback that it generates, as I said, based on this matrix, it will generate feedback. When you present I, it tries to predict the next word, which is eat. But if you present eat, it tries to predict the next word, but it could be 3 different words, but it's different strength. So that's what you can, I don't know if you don't see my mouse actually. But then the other people don't, it's okay. I just do it like this. So I don't know if you can see the colors, but cake has very strong feedback, and then nice and very have less feedback. So here, all good. But now let's see, what happens when you add an oscillation, and also this model has inhibition on top of it, which becomes important. Oh, that's here. So what happens when you add the oscillation is what you see here. So you see blue, red, which is the oscillation strength, but on top of that, there's the activation of the individual nodes. So what you can see is that here it's zoomed in, cake simply gets activated earlier relative to nice, relative to very. And this is purely based on this interaction between the strength of the feedback and together with the oscillation. So when the oscillation comes out of the inhibition thing, it goes into excitation. Cake simply already is pre-activated and therefore spikes first, therefore nice and therefore very. So this is to show that naturally by having an oscillation together with feedback, you generate kind of a phase code model. So in speech, and this is like, I hope this to you also gives a bit of this interaction between when and what, because what you present, suddenly the brain is activated at different moments depending on what you actually present. Okay. So this is the model. So how does this relate to what I said before regarding this da-ga? So I said, okay, we see this depending on the phase that you present something, participants are more likely to perceive da or ga. Well, what I didn't realize, that study was done in 2015. What I didn't realize at the time is that actually da is much more frequent than ga. So the word frequency, or the syllabic frequency of da, in Dutch at least, because this was Dutch participants, is much more frequent. So if you now put this together with what I just said about the excitability ordering phases, this could actually explain why this kind of pattern happens. So what we did is that we modeled this kind of frequency effect into this prediction paradigm. So da simply becomes more predictable than ga. Yes, that's the end of the sentence. So da simply becomes more predictable than ga, and then we try to model it and see how well it can explain this kind of behavior of behavioral oscillations. So this is what we found. We found that indeed you could predict very well this behavior. We found that 6.25 hertz in the original study. We also found an effect of 10 hertz. So we tried to also replicate that. So the full model could explain very well this kind of oscillatory behavior that dependent on when you present something in the stimulation stream, participants are more likely to perceive one or the other sound. I see I'm running, it's okay, actually. I might run a little, yeah, I will kill my question time, but okay. If you remove the inhibition, or if you remove the feedback, or if you remove the oscillation, so no feedback, no inhibition, no feedback, no oscillation, like the performance really drops, even though this is no difference in amount of parameters in the model, because the parameters are the same. So it seems that all these features of the model are very essential to explain this behavior. Yes, so then this is more interesting normally for people that do language. Of course, these are still individual words. So what happens in natural speech? We have normally words in context. So what it should mean is actually this is a person that's receiving speech. And one big problem in speech has always been that speech is not very rhythmic. This is the biggest criticism often of speech tracking models, that we use all these asynchronous kind of oscillatory speech tracking models, but speech is not very rhythmic. And my question here when I first found out is that, well, maybe actually there is an interaction between what you say and when you say it. So maybe if a word is more predictable, also for a producer, you just utter it faster. And this is intuitively makes some amount of sense. So we try to investigate this. So what we here did is a corpus analysis in which we investigated the onset differences between the current word and the next word, and then base it on whether the next word was actually more predictable. So the expectation was the more predictable a word is, the shorter the onset differences will be. So this was the big Dutch corpus where we did many other control factors, but I just want to show you the more interesting thing for here is that the onset differences were shorter when the next word is more predictable in the context. So in speech, naturally, if you speak and the next word is more predictable, it just comes earlier. Okay, so if you put these things together, two things together, firstly, what actually is in the corpus acoustically. Oh, it just went on, I didn't click. Together with this brain perspective, oscillatory tracking perspective, we can come up with this proposal. The proposal is, let's say there is I don't have any predictions of what I'm going to say next. Maybe naturally we would speak more asynchronously. This is a proposal, right? So if a producer, and that's what I call a weak model. So we have no predictions of what comes in the future. Maybe we speak very asynchronously. If a person that's receiving the speech has the same model, that might be perfectly fine, right? It can just track the speech asynchronously using the oscillations. But what if the producer suddenly has a very strong model? Maybe then it will produce the word cake earlier, right? Because as I said before, if something is predictable, you will utter it earlier. So this is, see, in the speech acoustic, then the speech comes earlier. But in this case, when the receiver has a very weak model of so if the receiver doesn't predict the next word cake, there is a clear mismatch because the speaker thinks the word should come later, but the producer actually does it earlier. In principle, normally it might not be the biggest problem, it's just not the most efficient thing. But if also the receiver predicts that the next word should be cake and it matches, as I said before, actually the representation of the word cake is then suddenly on a bit less excitable phase. So it seems to suddenly match what the producer is doing. So what I'm saying here is that naturally how we produce speech and this temporal variability seems to match with this phase coding perspective from that predictable words are simply on earlier phases. Okay. So then I get to the final study. I'm sorry for being more than 45 minutes. So this I have to present it because I did it with Lorenzo, who is here. So Lorenzo did a lot of this work. So the model predictions is that depending on the expectancy of the stimulus phase determines the percept. So I showed this a bit with this Daga, but we were not really convinced because maybe we missed a lot of other factors that could explain this effect. So we came up with this 4 different words that in Dutch are interesting. And it's again this Daga perspective, but we added a word component. So there are 4 different words that are gat, dat, gaat, and daad. Dat is with a D, but phonetically it's really a T. So the translations is whole, that, go, and deed. And what is interesting about this word is that the consonant frequency of the short A is the consonant frequency of the D is more frequent than the G, but the vowel frequency of the short A is more frequent than the long A. But the word frequency actually suddenly gets mixed around. So the word frequency of dat and gaat is high, but of gat and daad is low. And now you can see we get this nice double association between the consonant vowel frequencies and the word frequencies, and that's nice to work with. So for the rest of the talk, I will note this as this. So when it is a small letter, it's a low frequency thing. Capital letter means high frequency. So this one is low consonant frequency, high vowel frequency, low word frequency, because otherwise it becomes impossible to memorize. So first we did a behavioral study similar to what we did before, but now with ambiguous words. So we had first the word gat dat. If you do gat dat, you can see again, as I showed you before, this oscillatory pattern behaviorally. Then we did daad dat. Again, we can see this oscillatory pattern as before. But then we have the consonant, let me think, I always forget which ones is which. I'm not good in phonetic reading. Gaat dat. Gaat dat, there is no significant effect. And also for the gat gaat, there was no significant effect. Okay, a lot of data. So two are significant, two are not. What is the main difference? Well, the main difference between the two at this diagonal is that here for gat dat always is the high frequency word for every single feature in the word. Also for E, so this bottom left, dat is just the high frequency word for every single feature. But for the other two, one has the high frequency consonant and the other has the high frequency word. So it might be that these effects of frequency then counter each other out in the behavioral response. So and this is Lorenzo's project, what we try to do with MEG is whether we can separate the contributions of these features. So what is interesting is that the different regions, of course, process different parts of the speech signal. So then we can say, well, is the phase of a region that processes more consonant vowel features, does that determine the vowel percept? And does the phase of a higher order region that is important for words determine the word percept? That was our question. So we had three regions of interest, which is you can see on the top left, the superior temporal gyrus, the middle inferior temporal gyrus, and the inferior frontal gyrus, and represented the morphs dat gat and daad gaat. So not all combinations, there was too much. Then we had two contrasts. First, the consonant contrast and then the word contrast. For the consonant contrast, so whenever the participants heard gat or gaat, we compared the phase at which they perceived gat or gaat to the phase at which they perceived dat, daad. And for the word contrast, we did high and low frequency words. So whether they perceive the low frequency word gat, daad versus the high frequency word dat, daad. Then the analysis was a circular linear correlation between phase, so similar than before, and the response, whether this response was a low frequency or a high frequency response, either in the consonant or in the word domain. Okay, so these are the results. I don't show inferior frontal gyrus because there were no effects. The interesting effects were in the superior temporal gyrus and the middle temporal gyrus. So for the consonant contrast, I show this times 0 is again when we present the stimulus, and the rest is pre-stimulus. So for the consonants contrast, we find that the superior temporal gyrus shows a circular linear correlation where the participants perceive the low frequency or the high frequency consonant, but in the medial temporal gyrus, we don't find this effect. And then for the word contrast, it was the opposite. So for the superior temporal gyrus, no effect, but the medial temporal gyrus, we could see that dependent where the participants perceive the low or the high frequency word. And these are like they are orthogonal to each other. So that is, in that sense, a nice double dissociation. As a final thing, we splitted it up per stimulus interpretation. Yeah, so this is the same data, but now we just do a phase difference relative to the high frequency word, which is dot, which is high frequent on all the features. And what we would expect is that the phase difference when participants perceive the low frequency word should be very high, but it should be very low when it's the high frequency feature. So what you can see here for STG, that was the one where the consonant effect was significant. So you can see when the consonant had a high frequency, so that's for that, the phase difference is 0. But for the low frequency consonant, there was a very strong phase difference. Then for the MTG, this was dependent not on the consonant, but on the word frequency. So when the word frequency was high, so in this case for gat, there was a 0 phase difference. And the word frequency was low, so for the other two words, then there was a very high phase difference. I'm going to, yeah, so that was this study. I'm going to skip that one because it's very preliminary. I'm running out of time. So just to conclude all of this is that what these studies show, all this speech studies that are now highlighted and the computational modeling is that phase determines the percept relative to the frequency of word features. And this here, we showed even that this depends on the specificity of the regions that we're looking at. So this seems to be suggested of some form of excitability gradient that neural populations are simply active at different phases dependent on their excitability per se. So to conclude overall, I hope here I've provided a bit of evidence that oscillations are more than only windows of opportunity, which I think is still the main focus of the main idea of oscillation still, but they also can order activation patterns. And I think this ordering could be based on excitability of underlying representations. And I think this also could explain some dissociations in the literature between the different interpretation of the role of phase. So especially in the speech example, they come very nicely together, where there's in one sense, there is a windows of opportunity, but there's also ordering. Yeah, so this is a big thanks to everybody for the enframement study in the beginning that I did in New York for actually my master project. Then the working memory projects I did with Peter and Alexander. The Daga words that you saw, I did in the last study we did in Nijmegen. And very long ago in my PhD, I also did this syllable study. Yeah, and thanks for all of you for listening and the people online.
Yeah, just a quick question. Thank you for the great talk, very interesting. I might have missed that, but like in the last study, you first used the vowel frequency as a variable, and then you graded out. So my question is, didn't you have any significant effects, or were the effects similar to those of the consonant frequency?
So in the MEGs, so in the, let me go to this one, it's a bit clear. In the behavioral study, we had 4 contrasts, right? Because it's also easier to run a behavioral study, but in the MEG study, it already took quite long, so we had to choose, and we chose for the consonants, so we only ever chose 2 ambiguous words, not 4. Yeah, so that's why there's no vowel, because the vowel was always the same. No, the vowel was never in the morph, that should I say. So the morph was dat gat and dat gaat, but it was never gat gaat or dat daad. Okay. So yeah.
I see. And could you go on the previous slide, please? And like here you found like the main contrast was when both features were more frequent.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so when one stimulus had both the high frequency features and was in one stimulus and not mixed.
Okay, so there wasn't really a difference whether it's a constant or a vowel, right?
Well, this effect is stronger, right? The consonant there seems to be stronger than this effect here.
Okay, that's why you picked consonants for the image study.
Yes, and also to stay closest to the original study. That and to stay close, because in the original study we did dot ga, so at least we also wanted to replicate in some sense that effect. So there were 2 reasons for that. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Great study.
For the entrainment, is there a difference at what frequency you entrain?
In general, or for this specific?
No, in general.
Yeah, so let me think. So for this speech study, we used 3 different frequencies. So we did one 6.25 and 10. Both 6.25 and 10 worked, but one there was really no effect. So there was a difference. But for the original entrainment study, it was actually 1.5, and that's so much lower. So it's funny there. Well, Odette can talk along, but there's many in this whole field. It seems to be depending on what kind of tasks you use. Different frequencies are important. So that's a bit frustrating. So this what. My reasoning is, well, I do a lot of speech. So in the speech domain, we know that that's like the syllabic rate. So that makes sense. But for these slower frequencies, a lot of the people that are very strong in how the motor system and the auditory system interacts. And the motor system is 1.5. Also, like the tapping rate is very related to the slower rates. Yeah, I don't have a good answer for you. This is the rate.
For me, that's a good answer. So it really does matter.
It does matter, yeah.
Especially with respect.
Yeah. But yeah, it does matter, but it's task dependent. So that makes it, if you design a new task, you have to figure it out again. Yeah. Thanks for coming.
I was wondering, what are your, I think you use 2 words or 4 words, so it's a small vocabulary. How do you think it's going to scale to a bigger, kind of more real life situation, or at least with a bigger vocabulary?
Yeah, so let me think. In the corpus study we did, in this computational model, what we did try to do is look at actually the temporal difference and the predictability and see if that matches, in some sense, the model can predict those differences, and we could to some extent. So in that sense, that scales. But what I want to do experimentally is, well, the first study that I want to do is see if these effects also hold in context. So if the context changes, does then also the phase change? So that's what I want to do first. And then, yeah, in a beautiful thing, you can use a very big corpus, but these effects are often very sensitive. So I find that that's like 10 years from now. So, but yeah, the first thing is the context, because these are individual words, and ideally, this would be how it works in real life speech, right? Where you constantly make predictions and dynamically it shifts. So I do want to do studies in context. And that's the first step. So that's my very preliminary. There's some evidence, but the results are very weak now. Yeah. But that's the direction.
Any questions on this topic? I also had one. You talk about this link, of course, between the temporal variability and the phase coding. I was wondering if you have an idea on how that could also relate to then evoked responses to the stimuli. So whether there could be also a link between the spray stimulus phase difference that we see and then the evoked responses later. Whether if you could speculate.
Well, in some sense, I guess in this, like it depends if you just look at the general shape of the evoked responses or the actual neurons that are activated, because this working memory study shows that different representations are activated. But if you look, this I didn't show, but if you look purely at the ERP, they're indistinguishable. It's really in the decoding. So if you just take the average over a bigger region, ERP kind of style, we don't see a big difference. But if you look at the decoding performance, which looks more a multivariate pattern of the activity, there we do. So I believe, well, to find this decoding difference, there has to be a difference in the evoked response, but not like classically ERP-wise, right, where we average over many channels, but the evoked response distribution is different. Different neuronal populations should be activated. We did another study that I now didn't present it, where we also tried to decode the response depending on the phase, and there we also could do it. So depending on we first found this phase-dependent effect, participants receive A or B, and then we could also decode A or B based on the evoked responses. So the evoked responses do change. Yeah, if that's, yeah, I guess that's the answer.
And for the decoding side, actually, to go back to the slide. Yes.
Oh yeah, it's because it's on the presentation mode. This one, where.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. So in this study, you find the phase effect for the decoding performance. So the decoding was better when similar surface. I was wondering if you had also investigate? Like, was there different phases for the different stimuli here also analyzed for the different orientations? If you have also checked phase differences as well?
So you mean depending on the orient? You mean if there was a bias to one or the other orientation?
Yes, in the recording.
I didn't look at that here because it's a bit, yeah.
Because yeah, you sort it again by accuracy.
Yeah. Yeah, you could sort whether it's one. The problem is, of course, here there are many options, right? So it's a bit. It's not like it's not a two-option thing, and it's not clear which would be like. Of course, in orientation there is a little bit regarding like cardial versus horizontal and vertical being a bit high, having a stronger representation. So that could be something that is interesting regarding this excitability hypothesis. But yeah, at that time. Yeah, that was At that for this study, I wasn't looking at that effect, but yeah, it could be done. It's true.
So I have a question about the dot gut and all that, paradigm.
Yes.
So when I looked at the ga versus da, and you talked about representational interpretation, I was more thinking in terms of when rather than what, because the entrainment pulses determine when the window, when the window, is going to be located for the, for a better decoding, for a better representation. Now. So that was my first, question to say. I mean, why are you, connecting that to representation? That mean what rather than when? And then we go to the more elaborate work, the 2021 work. I'm going to look at it very carefully, and I wonder if we have to look into different, layers in the hierarchy. When you talk about when, you use the acoustics, but then once the acoustics is being determined, then you have the question of, how context, what you say, frequency, is put in play in terms of further decoding higher layers. So that's what I wanted to ask, your opinion about that.
Yeah, I guess just to rephrase what you're saying is you think that the results could be explained by simply like having this idea what Ankosum also had in her study that do you mean the sampling that we have two cycles of theta that might be relevant, or I'm just trying to grasp.
Well, so if we go first to the ga versus da, your result is in line with Hickok's work, where he looked into, better detection, of information, as a function of what happens when you stop the entrainment pulses. So the notion was that, and also Benedict talked about that. That when you stop the entrainment pulses, there are still 2 or 3 cycles, they're still going on, and you are putting the window accordingly. So
maybe I could answer you with another study, because like Hickok's study and many others, also Benedict's study, they look indeed at detection and accuracy, but it's difficult to say what is the better accurate option for that gat. And we did a study, which is in eye science, where we tried to dissociate accuracy from representation, in which we had I didn't present it here. So there we had a psychometric curve and taught participants to say whether it's stimulus A or B. But there we had not fully ambiguous stimuli, but also stimuli that were clearly, they were A or B, but not fully ambiguous. So there was a correct answer. But if you look at whether participants are biased to say A or B, whether they're actually more accurate in saying what the representation is, we found an effect of bias, but not of accuracy. So there, I'm just providing another explanation. Like there, I often don't find effective accuracy or detection. Actually, I always find effects of whether participants are more biased to say one thing. So I think there's something that should combine. I don't think like all the studies are very interesting and relevant, but I find in those studies I try to dissociate these effects of accuracy, and I don't find effects of accuracy, only of bias.
Well, no, but again, I agree with you. They looked into detection, and you are looking into more than detection. You are looking into classification.
Yeah.
And but again, you know, to me, well, we talked about it before in Paris and so on. The question, the big question is, you guys, you know, believe that context affect, you know, the when.
Yes, yes.
And that is the question in I think at the center of it, because I don't see how, you know, it affects the when. You know, how do you know ahead of time, especially in continuous speech, but also here, you know, if you would put 4 words, you know, not just A versus B, but A versus B, C, and D, you know, you say that the context affect where the window is going to be put. And that's where I don't see that, you know. That's why I'm suggesting that the acoustics is going to put the window, and then the next layer in the hierarchy, we look at that window and use context to make the decision.
I don't say that, like, if you talk about window in the sense of being similar to like the phase of the oscillation, I don't say that in advance we change the phase of the oscillation. I say that dependent on the stimulus, it happens to appear on a different phase. So you don't proactively change the phase, it's just a consequence of the stimulus coming earlier that you think, oh, this was probably from my lexicon, a stimulus that is more likely to happen. That's what I'm saying. I don't say that we change the phase proactively. I don't think that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
Hi, Sanne. Thank you for the very nice talk. So I wanted to ask you about the last MSc study that you were presenting about the regions of interest, because on the picture you were showing only the left hemisphere regions of interest. And I was wondering to what extent you also look at the right hemisphere regions of interest, if you took both. Yeah.
In the paper, it's a combination of both. So you looked at both. I tried at some point to see if we found a significant difference between the regions, but I didn't find a clear effect of a difference between the regions. So in the final analysis, it's collapsed over both.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
We have no more questions. Then I would like to thank again Sanne